This photograph was taken in Berlin in the summer of 1945, just a few weeks after Germany surrendered. The city was in ruins. Thousands were dead. But look closely at what these children are doing. Berlin wasn't destroyed in one night. It took 5 years of bombing. The first major raid came in August 1940. The worst came in February 1945. 3 days of non-stop bombing. 50,000 people died in 1 week. The Allies dropped 45,000 tons of bombs on Berlin. That's the weight of 30,000 cars falling from the sky. Every single night, families would hear the air raid sirens and run to the shelters. Children grew up thinking this was normal. When the war ended, 80% of Berlin's men were either dead or prisoners of war. So the women had to rebuild the city themselves. They were called Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women. Between 1945 and 1950, an estimated 60,000 women worked clearing rubble in Berlin alone. They weren't soldiers, they were teachers, mothers, grandmothers. Some were as old as 70. They worked in human chains. One woman would pick up a brick, pass it to the next woman. She'd pass it to the next. And slowly, one brick at a time, the city was cleared. For the children in this photo, life was a strange mix of horror and play. They had no toys, no playgrounds, no swings. But they had tanks, rubble, bomb craters filled with water. One survivor, Hans Müller, remembers, "We would race each other through the ruins, climb the broken walls, jump from one pile of bricks to another. It was our playground. We didn't know any different." Food was scarce. Rations in 1945 were 1,000 calories per day, half of what a child needs. Mothers would dig through the rubble looking for potatoes. Some families ate grass soup. This generation was called the rubble children, Trümmerkinder. The tank in this photo is a Panzer IV, a German tank. It was likely abandoned during the Battle of Berlin in April 1945. When Soviet forces entered the city, German soldiers either fled or surrendered. They left thousands of tanks behind. For years, these tanks just sat there, too heavy to move, too damaged to use. So they became part of the landscape. Children climbed them. Families used them as storage. Some people even lived inside them. This photo was taken by an American photographer, likely a soldier or journalist documenting post-war Germany. We don't know his name, but his photo became iconic. So what happened to these children? Most of them survived. They became the generation that rebuilt Germany. They started businesses, raised families, built the Berlin Wall, and later tore it down. If you go to Berlin today, you won't see any rubble. The city is clean, modern, thriving. But if you know where to look, you can still find traces of the past. Bullet holes in old buildings, memorials, museums. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you might meet one of these children. Now, in their 80s, still smiling. This photograph is more than just a moment in time. It's a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity survives. Not because of governments or armies, but because of ordinary people, women clearing rubble, children finding joy in the ruins. War destroys cities, but people rebuild them. And life always finds a way. This is a German family in the winter of 1946. A father, 3 children. They are in the forest, collecting firewood. But this is not a normal winter. This is the hunger winter, the coldest winter in decades. And millions of Germans are starving. When World War II ended in May 1945, Germany was in ruins. Cities were destroyed. Infrastructure was gone. And the Allies divided the country into 4 occupation zones: But the problems didn't end with the war. Food production had collapsed. Transportation networks were broken. And in the winter of 1946, one of the worst winters of the century arrived. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. Rivers froze. Coal supplies ran out. And the food rations dropped to 1,000 calories per day, half of what a human needs to survive. In the cities, people were starving. Families burned furniture to stay warm. They ate grass, tree bark, potato peels. But in the countryside, there was a chance to survive. Forests became lifelines. Every day, families like this one would walk for hours, searching for firewood. Children, as young as 5, would help carry branches. Look at this photograph. The mother is wearing a heavy coat, but it's worn and patched. The children have scarves wrapped around their faces. Their hands are red from the cold. Behind them, you can see a small cart, a hand wagon. This is how they transported the wood back home. Mile after mile, through snow and ice, just to keep the fire burning for one more night. The hunger winter of 1946-47 killed thousands. Exact numbers are unknown, but estimates range from 100,000 to several hundred thousand deaths across Germany and the Netherlands. The elderly died first, then the children. Diseases spread: tuberculosis, typhus, dysentery. Hospitals had no medicine. Morgues had no space. In cities like Hamburg and Cologne, people collapsed on the streets from hunger. In rural areas, families like this one survived, barely. By the spring of 1947, the worst was over. The Marshall Plan began bringing food aid from America, but the scars remained. An entire generation grew up knowing what it meant to be truly hungry. This photograph is not about war. It's about what comes after. The mother in this picture didn't fight in the war. The children didn't drop bombs, but they paid the price. And every winter, when the snow falls in Germany, there are still people who remember. The cold, the hunger, the long walks through the forest, the hunger winter. Similar story, different location. 5 years earlier, another winter, another city. But this time, the cold was not the only enemy. This photograph was taken in Leningrad in the winter of 1941. Women are pulling sleds through the rubble, but they are not carrying firewood. They are carrying bodies. In September 1941, Nazi Germany surrounded Leningrad. The city was cut off. No food, no fuel, no escape. The siege would last 872 days, almost 2.5 years, and it would become one of the deadliest events in human history. By winter, the food rations had dropped to 125 grams of bread per day. That's 2 slices per day, for adults, for children, for everyone. People ate anything they could find. Wallpaper paste, made from flour. Leather belts, boiled for hours. Pet cats and dogs disappeared within weeks. Some ate sawdust. Some ate grass. And when there was nothing left, some turned to cannibalism. The Soviet authorities documented over 2,000 cases. People were arrested for eating human flesh. But hunger makes people do unthinkable things. The winter of 1941 was one of the coldest on record. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. The Neva River froze solid. Electricity stopped. Heating stopped. People burned books, furniture, floorboards. Every morning, new bodies appeared on the streets, frozen, dead from hunger or cold. Families would pile them on sleds, like the ones in this photograph, and drag them to collection points. Morgues overflowed. Mass graves were dug in the frozen ground. By the end of the first winter, over 200,000 people had died. By the time the siege ended in January 1944, the death toll reached 1 million. But Leningrad did not surrender. Despite the hunger, despite the cold, the city held. Factories kept running, producing weapons even as workers collapsed from starvation. The Leningrad Symphony Orchestra performed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony in August 1942, in the middle of the siege. Many musicians were so weak they could barely hold their instruments, but they played. And when Lake Ladoga froze in winter, a supply route opened, the road of life. Trucks carried food across the ice. Many broke through and sank, but enough made it. Leningrad survived. This photograph is not about war. It's about endurance. These women didn't fight on the front lines, but they carried the dead. They survived the cold. They refused to surrender. And Leningrad never fell. 2 winters, 2 cities, 2 different wars, but the same story. When winter comes, the weak die first. The strong endure. And humanity somehow survives. Germany, 1946. Leningrad, 1941. Millions died. But both cities rebuilt, and life went on.